Hello and welcome back everyone, we Weeb Online, and today I'm gonna start a new series, What If Kurama Took Over Naruto's Body Part 1. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
Umino Iruka had done many things in his life that he regretted. He'd cheated on some school tests. He'd got Kuchan accused of punching IM. On a mission, he'd killed an innocent person. He'd had far too much fun almost tearing someone apart with a nasty jutsu. He'd killed a child, and there were so many other things he wished he hadn't done. He was about to add something else to that list. He returned his gaze to the ANBU behind him and received several nods. His senses were heightened to new levels of awareness by his own adrenaline, and that of the people around him as he walked forward. On the ground, his footsteps were audible. The trees were all dead and shedding their leaves on the ground. Iruka's fingers twitched in the direction of the kunai and shuriken he was carrying, but he didn't draw any. He took 5 more steps forward before coming to a halt. There was a terrible silence for an instant, and then Iruka heard it. It was a rumble that came from the ground itself. Iruka felt chakra rush against his skin and a burning sensation. He inhaled deeply, and the air tasted metallic. The rumble faded gradually, but the metallic taste lingered. Iruka licked his lips after briefly closing his eyes. They had the flavor of blood. Naruto. The word rang out loudly. Even as he formed more words to say, Iruka flinched. Are you there, Naruto? He waited for his response, which was a flash of burning chakra. His muscles tightened, and something inside him screamed for him to run. Malice and bloodlust filled the chakra that gathered around him. Dead leaves rained down from a tree, each bursting into flames before hitting the ground. Iruka's fists tightened as he waited for the entire forest to catch fire. Iruka waited because it didn't. His breathing was quick, and sweat was dripping down his brow. He knew he had to flee. Chakra was forming around him like a storm. As it swirled through the air, he could almost see it. Every breath he took burned in his lungs. SSSS Sensei, hissed a voice. Iruka shivered all over. His skin crawled, and standing still was all he could do. He tried but couldn't close his eyes. He stood there watching as something slid around the trees and came to a halt. Iruka wet his lips again and tried again before he could speak. Come here, Naruto, he said hoarsely. The chakra was now accompanied by an unpleasant odor that made Iruka gag. Iruka could detect a heavy, clinging, musky odor. All around Iruka, leaves cracked and broke. He could now pinpoint the source of the odor in chakra. He stared in horror as the creature moved forward. It was once a boy, a small, golden-haired boy with big blue eyes and a unique smile. It was once a promising shinobi who cared deeply about his comrades and village. It was once Uzumaki Naruto. It was now something else. The limbs were too long, and the ears had grown obscenely long. It had claws and a mouthful of fangs, except when it wanted to be seen. It moved in such a way that searching eyes passed over it. It caught someone with its eyes if it wanted to be seen. Those eyes were a terrifying bloody red, and one look was enough to sap any shinobi's courage. Iruka held his ground as the creature crept closer. It instantly burned up the leaves it came into contact with. Chakra radiated from it. What was left of its clothes and sharp claws were stained with blood. It advanced on Iruka, its gaze fixed on him. Iruka took a stand. His heart pounded in his chest, and his thoughts turned to the ANBU behind him. He recalled the Hawk ANBU's plan for dealing with the creature. He remembered the trap's trigger point, which was only 3 yards ahead of him, and what would happen if the creature triggered the trap. For a brief moment, he almost yelled at the creature to flee, but then he noticed the blood-stained claws. He kept his gaze low and resumed speaking. Where have you been, Naruto? He inquired. His voice cracked as he licked his lips again. It's been a while, hasn't it? The creature continued its sliding advance, growling low in its throat. Iruka struggled to focus his gaze on it. It finally came to a halt and looked at him. Iruka was overcome with regret, but he remembered what he'd been told. Naruto was no longer present in the beast. The Kyuubi had devoured Naruto. Iruka's heart clenched suddenly. Why was he calling for the boy if Naruto was gone? Why was the Kyuubi approaching a man who was calling for Naruto? Why did they need him to summon the Kyuubi? Iruka. Why did they need Naruto, the first person he had learned to trust? Unless... Iruka raised her head. He looked into the creature's eyes, which did not move towards him or away from him. Its eyes were red when it looked at him. The eyes were an obscenely bright red around the pupil, but the color faded as it traveled out, and there was a ring of dull purple on the very edges of the iris. SS Sensei. The creature almost purred as it resumed its forward motion. Iruka's eyes widened and he took a step back. The creature moved forward, its lips opening wide enough to reveal all of its teeth. He would be close enough in seconds to set off the trap. in just a few steps. When Iruka opened her mouth, it was immediately filled with a musky, bloody taste. For months, Konoha had been terrorized by this creature. This was the Kyuubi who had assassinated Iruka's parents. This was a mindless killing machine that needed to be exterminated. So, what made it respond to Naruto's name? There was a chakra crackle. The Naruto-like creature took a step forward. Iruka took a deep breath and exclaimed, "Naruto, move." The creature sprang into action, leaping up and away. Iruka was sent flying backwards by a chakra explosion. For a few startling seconds, he felt a blanket of white all around him. Iruka landed on the ground and slid through the rustling leaves. He heard a deafening noise that sounded both like a roar and a scream. His hands clutched his head, and he felt wet flow between his fingers. The noise abruptly stopped, taking with it the overpowering chakra and smell. Iruka became disoriented for a brief moment. He stumbled to his feet and looked around. Iruka could see the ANBU looking at him through the fine ash on the ground. They were conversing, but Iruka couldn't understand them. He was only aware that they were conversing about him. He'd just completely botched the mission. He'd just let the Kyuubi get away. Only, it wasn't just the Kyuubi. They'd deceived him. Naruto, they said, had been devoured by the Kyuubi's demonic presence. It said that preventing the Kyuubi from using Naruto's body would be a service to him. Naruto had been reported missing. They'd deceived him. They had attempted to force him to kill Naruto. The ANBU moved, but Iruka's hands had already begun to form signs. He drew chakra and slammed his rage into a jutsu he hadn't used in nearly 10 years. He'd purposefully failed a mission, putting other shinobi in danger. He was now attacking another shinobi, but he didn't mind. He didn't give a damn. They had attempted to force him to kill Naruto. They'd deceived him. Water rushed through the clearing, destroying trees and sweeping away everything in its path. The ANBU that had escaped clung grimly to the top branches of the tree, waiting for the water to recede. It did, but all that was left was damp dead grass swept clean. The tree trunks had been scorched. A burnt circle of ground smelled strongly of wet ash. The ground had become saturated, and the grass was attempting to regrow green. It wouldn't be able to do it with the Kyuubi around, but it would try. Grass was never defeated. Kakashi took a step back and looked at the Hawk ANBU. Who is he? The ANBU motioned with his hand to the edge of the clearing, which was completely dry. He sabotaged the mission. Kakashi's visible brow furrowed. I suppose he panicked. The ANBU made a shaky motion with his head. No, he walked out to the designated spot and summoned the Kyuubi, as we expected. But right before the trap triggered, he warned it. The ANBU growled. He warned the Kyuubi. Isn't this the Yumino Iruka whose parents were killed by the Kyuubi? Kakashi inquired as he gazed across the clearing. How many people did we lose? Yes, and in terms of casualties, the ANBU shrugged. There were a few broken bones and one half-drowned person, but no one died. That's better than our previous attempts, Kakashi remarked. Could the chakra of the Kyuubi have influenced Iruka? The ANBU smirked. If it had, I'm sure he'd have stopped running by now. You're still chasing him? Kakashi looked at the ANBU, puzzled. How many ANBU are there? 3, but one returned after landing on a caltrop-covered branch, the Hawk ANBU reported. Iruka's reserves must be nearly depleted. The man hasn't been on a real mission in 6 years, and he's never taken a mission higher than B will catch him soon. Do you know why he hasn't been on a mission in a long time? Kakashi inquired. No, do you? Said the ANBU in response to the question. He was deemed unsuitable for them soon after achieving Chunin, but he was allowed to teach at the Shinobi Academy, Kakashi pondered. An injury is unlikely because he is avoiding ANBU. Or not, grumbled the Hawk ANBU. If the injury is old, it may take time to affect him. We'll know when he's apprehended. The Kyuubi didn't kill anyone, Kakashi asked, looking at the scorched ground. Iruka was not attacked. It didn't even make a move towards him, and it vanished the moment Iruka warned it about the trap. The ANBU growled now. What did Iruka warn it with? Kakashi inquired. Shouted, Naruto, move, and the Kyuubi got away, again. The ANBU followed Kakashi's gaze to the burnt ground, and a musky wind began to blow. The trees he was running alongside weren't dead, but they were dormant, and they repelled chakra rather than gently attracting it. It was easy to misjudge a step and slip. Iruka couldn't afford to make that mistake again. He'd lost the first ANBU due to dumb luck and a quick hand, but the remaining 2 were wary, hanging back and not running close together. It would be impossible to get rid of both of them at the same time, but he had to. There was no turning back now. He could have stayed in the clearing with the ANBU and just said he'd lost his nerve, or that the Kyuubi looked so much like Naruto that he panicked, or any number of other things and been reprimanded. But what he'd done had labeled him as a traitor, and he didn't want to go back. Iruka pushed off another tree branch and leapt higher into the canopy. Traveling by treetop was easier, but it was also more difficult to hide, so Iruka needed some way to get out of sight so he could set some sort of trap. Iruka's hands began forming signs as his mind began forming a plan. The first clone jumped off to the left behind a tree, and the second stopped and tried to tackle the closest ANBU. But it missed, and the dodging ANBU was slapped in the chest with a branch as thick as Iruka's thigh. The ANBU flew backwards and fell. The remaining ANBU threw a handful of kunai at Iruka, two of which skimmed his left arm, and Iruka threw a kunai blindly back as he forced chakra back into his legs and feet. His muscles were all burning, and he had a stitch in his side. He couldn't, and wasn't, counting on the ANBU being tired. Iruka mentally blessed all the students he'd had to chase down over the years. Iruka was vaguely aware that his clone was keeping pace with the ANBU a few feet behind and to the left of them. Iruka's arm, where he'd been hit with the ANBU's kunai, was becoming numb. Poison was something Iruka hadn't anticipated. It was spreading slowly, but the faster his heart beat, the faster the poison spread. So act now, Iruka thought to himself as he leapt down a few branches and made a shaky descent to the forest floor. His arm was numb, he was low on chakra, and he was tired. He wouldn't survive a long battle, so he had to finish it quickly. Iruka spun around and was met with a hail of kunai and shuriken. He jumped back, but several hit his legs. He dodged the ANBU's punch aimed at his stomach, and jerked three of the more firmly lodged shuriken out of his calf, which he easily deflected. The ANBU paused for a moment, and its masked face looked at Iruka. The ANBU were elite. Everyone, especially shinobi, knew the ANBU were Konoha's best. Shinobi children looked at the ANBU with awe, knowing that, while the ANBU were dangerous, they would never be hurt by one because they were Konoha's future. Iruka deflected a kick to the head and caught a punch to the stomach. A kunai slashed across his shoulder, but he managed to slam his own kunai into the ANBU's arm, slowing it down a little. Iruka threw a double handful of kunai at the ANBU and watched it dodge. Iruka rolled with the pull and landed hard on his back. He pulled the ANBU forward, and the ANBU turned the motion into a somersault over Iruka. Iruka jerked his arm free and jumped to his feet. The ANBU landed awkwardly. The ANBU turned to face the apparently unarmed clone and moved back slowly, out of the clone's drop. The movement didn't help him much. The clone, gifted with an explosive tag at birth, exploded before it hit the ground, sending the ANBU flying. Iruka paused for a moment before limping over to where the ANBU lay unconscious. Iruka stepped back from the ANBU and began pulling kunai and shuriken from his body. Only the first batch had been poisoned, but his arm was now completely numb, and the poison was still spreading. Iruka took a moment to gather some stray shuriken and kunai, fearing that if he stopped moving, he wouldn't be able to move again. Iruka gingerly limped away from the ANBU, covered in tiny cuts and puncture wounds. The worst wounds he had were the gash on his shoulder and the poison stab wound above his elbow. He only had a weak generic antidote to try to. Maybe. Asuma looked at Kakashi, who was sitting serenely in the clearing. His eye was closed, and his posture looked utterly relaxed. Asuma refrained from moving. If he moved too quickly, he'd end up with a kunai in an uncomfortable place. Kakashi only looked relaxed. He was really keyed up. Asuma cleared his throat gently and shifted his stance against one of the large trees, the base of which was scarred with many claw marks, and Asuma was fairly certain he knew what had made those marks. This part of the woods smelled especially strongly of kyuubi, and the clinging odor was nauseating. Kakashi's shoulders twitched, and he slowly stood up. 3 different nin dogs ran into the clearing, and Kakashi walked forward to meet them. Asuma followed Kakashi, wary of the kyuubi, which emitted a rancid stench and enough chakra to power 10 shinobi. Kakashi sighed lightly as his dogs vanished in a puff of smoke. No luck, eh? Asuma deduced. After a while, the kyuubi's scent overpowers any other smell, and I think he walked down a stream for a while. I suppose he could have fallen in and drowned, Kakashi mused, unconcerned about the events of the day. It's pretty amazing that a Chunin escaped 3 ANBU, Asuma observed. They underestimated him, and I suppose he just had a little luck on his side, Kakashi said, echoing Asuma's thoughts. There was no way a Chunin could take down 3 ANBU with his skill alone. How are things going with the ANBU? Kakashi inquired. Well, one escaped with holes all over his feet, the second with a cracked sternum and a broken ankle, and the third with first-degree burns on his arms and legs and a concussion, Asuma shrugged. They might die of shame if word gets out that they were beaten by a Chunin. I hope they learn from this, Kakashi said, shrugging his shoulders. There's nothing else we can do here. With that, the shinobi jumped up the nearest tree and launched himself into the branches, with Asuma close behind. It didn't matter that the Chunin had escaped, they'd catch him the next day. By the time night fell, Iruka's left arm was not numb, but it ached. His right shoulder, both cut and strained, refused to move much. His legs ached from overuse, and he was dangerously low on chakra. He'd used the last bit he dared to climb up an almost branchless tree to sleep in a large hollow, despite having to chase several birds out of it. Iruka had washed and bandaged his wounds with the meager supplies he'd brought with him because he hadn't expected to do much this morning except draw out the Kyuubi, and he hadn't needed much for that. He carried bandages, an all-purpose antidote, and wound salve with him at all times out of habit. Iruka would have chuckled if he hadn't been worried that someone would hear him. The skills and habits he had learned from teaching for the past 6 years had kept him alive for so long. He knew standard procedure better than most shinobi on active duty. He knew more about the individual clans than many shinobi outside the clans. Every time Iruka closed his eyes, he saw the Kyuubi. No, it was Naruto. Somewhere inside that changed body, Naruto was still alive. He hadn't been completely crushed by the Kyuubi's presence yet, which meant there was still a chance to get Naruto back. The Grand Council knew this, which was why Iruka had been chosen to lure the Kyuubi Naruto into a trap to kill it. It was true that the Kyuubi had been wreaking havoc in Konoha for the past 6 months, though the creature mostly stayed in the woods right outside Konoha. Anyone who entered the Kyuubi's woods was attacked and most had died. Iruka leaned back against the tree, winced. Naruto was still alive, and it was possible to bring him back. But no one else seemed to care. Getting rid of the Kyuubi was more important to them than bringing Naruto back. Naruto had been an outcast since birth, with no one loving him or even being kind to him. Iruka, on the other hand, had been loved by his parents until they died fighting the Kyuubi, but Naruto had had no one. He'd saved Konoha by using his infant body and, despite receiving no thanks for his first task, had decided to become a shinobi. Naruto had decided to dedicate his life to preserving a village that had done nothing but condemn. They could try, but Iruka wasn't going to let them kill Naruto just to get rid of the Kyuubi. He was still disgusted and enraged that they had tried to kill Naruto, and the Kyuubi using him and whatever consciousness Naruto had left. There had to be another way, but this way is easier for them. Iruka thought bitterly as his body began to relax. He wasn't going to let Naruto die. He'd find a way to get the boy back in control of his body, or get rid of the Kyuubi without killing him. He closed his eyes, seeing the Kyuubi Naruto again and recalling the blood-stained claws. But what if Naruto didn't want to return after what the Kyuubi had done? Iruka remembered at least 10 shinobi being killed by the Kyuubi, but he hadn't paid much attention after the first few deaths because he didn't want to know. Would Naruto even want to live after his body had been used to kill so many Konoha shinobi? Would he blame himself for the Kyuubi's appearance? Iruka's entire body shuddered at the thought of killing Naruto. He'd learned a long time ago that life wasn't fair, but that didn't mean he liked it. Maybe his reasoning was selfish and biased, but he didn't want to kill Naruto. Iruka knew Naruto couldn't let the Kyuubi out on purpose, and he wasn't even sure Naruto, with his poor chakra control and inability to understand complex. Iruka knew about necessary sacrifice. He knew that for the sake of Konoha, the Kyuubi had to be eliminated before it killed more people. So far, the Kyuubi had been content to stay in its patch of dead trees, but that could change. He understood the reasoning that even if Naruto was still alive, the Kyuubi's vessel needed to be killed, but that didn't mean he agreed with it. Iruka shifted slightly and rubbed a cramp in his calf. He'd chosen Naruto over Konoha because someone, he felt, needed to be on the boy's side for once. If the boy wanted to die, he could make that decision himself. Iruka couldn't decide whether Naruto should or wanted to die. Iruka leaned his head against the hard bark and half closed his eyes. His muscles, especially his leg muscles, burned, and he knew he'd be stiff in the morning. He'd have to move to a different hiding spot sometime in the night. But for now he needed rest. Tomorrow he was certain he'd be chased again. He was certain he'd only gotten away today because the ANBU had underestimated him. Some creature in the night screamed, and Iruka tensed. His abused body screamed in protest, and he slowly relaxed. He let his eyes close further, and let the image of the Kyuubi Naruto burn into his mind. That was what he had to stop. That was what he had to save. Tomorrow would be a hellborn day. Iruka ate raw fish for breakfast, hoping that the Kyuubi's chakra hadn't poisoned the fish. The fish looked fine, and tasted fine, and he was relieved to discover that he was still a good bare-handed fisherman. Iruka felt rather happy for a man who was probably eating his last meal, feeling better than he had in a long time, even with all his injuries throbbing and burning when he moved. His chakra was still low, and he would be chased today, likely dead or captured by noon. But he was now humming a rather cheerful child's song. It seemed absurd to be cheerful given the circumstances, but Iruka had never claimed to be a particularly sane person. He sat with his bare feet in the shallow creek that had supplied his breakfast, and listened to the almost silent forest. Most of the birds had fled the forest upon the arrival of the Kyuubi, and there were few other creatures as well. But the stream had a healthy supply of fish. Of course, the Kyuubi could have been eating the other creatures of the forest, which would explain why there were so many fish. Certainly, the Kyuubi could catch fish, and Naruto could even catch fish barehanded, which Iruka had spent the better part of 2 days teaching the boy how to do. Iruka tensed as he heard something rustle in the leaves. He gradually relaxed and focused on the noise. Something was shuffling towards him. It didn't sound like someone was trying to sneak up on him, but he still reached for a kunai while tugging his flak jacket straight. He whipped around, gathering himself into a ready position. The rabbit flicked its ears up and bounced away into the forest, leaving Iruka with a wry smile. He replaced his kunai and stood up, pulling his shoes back on. Nothing else was stirring, and the air still smelled faintly of the Kyuubi. Iruka sighed. He needed a plan that went beyond don't get killed and save Naruto. While those were good goals, he needed a plan to get there. His mother had always said one had to go back to the cookie jar to find out who ate all the cookies. In Iruka's case, that meant going back to Konoha, which would have been much easier if you hadn't blown up yesterday. Iruka grumbled to himself, but he didn't regret his actions yesterday. He'd been lied to, and he didn't trust Konoha anymore. Maybe if Sandaime was still alive, he would have reacted differently. If Sandaime was still alive, everything about the mission would have been explained to him. There is no use crying over spilt blood, Iruka muttered softly, grinning. His mother's sayings were very fresh in his mind today, perhaps because he'd shown off the temper he'd inherited from her. That wasn't to say his father hadn't had a temper, but Iruka's mother had been far more volatile than her husband had ever been. Iruka sat down again, this time with his back to a tree. There was no way he could get into Konoha as he was, unless he was willingly captured. He'd probably be killed as a traitor before he had a chance to do anything. He needed to heal and replenish his chakra before attempting to infiltrate Konoha. His scar would be difficult to conceal. There were too many shinobi who could easily see through genjutsu. He'd have to sneak in without being seen or completely disguise his appearance by physical means. Given that he didn't have anything to disguise himself with, he'd have to sneak in without being seen. Iruka had a sneaking suspicion he wouldn't make it through the week. When Asuma and Kurenai got genin teams, they started spending more time together, and Kurenai discovered that even though Asuma didn't really have a team anymore, they were still spending time together. Now, as the morning turned into afternoon, they sat watching Asuma's and Kurenai's old teams alternately sparring and goofing off. Have they still not caught the Chunin? Kurenai wondered as she watched Shino flip Kiba through the air, and Akamaru immediately attacked the Aburame. Nope, Kakashi's dogs lost the scent because of the Kyuubi's smell, and he avoided the ANBU. Asuma exhaled a long plume of smoke. A Chunin team is on the lookout for him right now. Why send some Chunin after him if he avoided ANBU? Kurenai inquired. He's injured, low on chakra, and exhausted. I think he's snapped, and if that's the case, he won't be reasonable at all. Asuma rolled his eyes. Kurenai turned to Asuma and said he was teaching the future shinobi of Konoha. He had to be trustworthy and rational, but not trusted enough to go out on missions. He was fortunate yesterday, but he was not hired as a teacher because he could not fight. There was another reason, and I'd like to know what it was. Asuma flicked the ash from his cigarette. Have you ever met this Yumino before? I talked to him when I first got my phone. I think that was the only time we ever spoke to each other, but I do remember his outbursts when we nominated ourselves for the Chunin exam. Kurenai said. Right, I'd forgotten about that, Asuma grumbled. Hayate said something after the incident. I believe he meant Kakashi was fortunate not to have a broken nose, or perhaps he meant Iruka was fortunate not to have a broken nose. If he was still alive, we might ask him, Kurenai sighed. We've lost too many shinobi, Asuma. Kurenai returned his gaze to the young ones, who had broken off into pairs and were sparring with incredible ferocity. Even Shikamaru was putting forth obvious effort against Kiba. Asuma's expression indicated that he was thinking along her lines. Kurenai, do you feel like you're throwing them to the wolves? Kurenai nodded, but we'll have to rely on them to keep an eye out for trouble. If they stay on the forest's borders, they'll be less likely to be attacked. She didn't sound happy, but Asuma wasn't happy either. He didn't like that their former selves were being used as border patrols on a forest containing a creature that could easily kill a team of a NBU. If it attacked them, they wouldn't have a chance. That was probably why the genin were being posted there. Shikamaru looked up at them, and both Jounin could see the frown on his face. Asuma waved a hand at him, but the young Chunin's frown just deepened. Asuma knew Shikamaru had figured out the most likely reason he and his year mates were posted on the forest's borders. Shikamaru seemed to like the idea even worse than Asuma and Kurenai. A wild punch from Ino smacked Shikamaru in the cheek, and a brawl erupted on the green field. Kurenai shook her head, Asuma smiled, and the two jumped forward to break up the fight. Iruka had avoided all 6 Chunin until midday, when he was noticed. He'd managed to nick a smoke bomb off one to make a quick escape, but he was in trouble, even worse than yesterday. He had less than half his chakra back, and his left arm was slow to react. Iruka would have a chance if he could separate the Chunin, and the best way to do so was. 2 clones appeared to their left, with Iruka to their right, and the 3 Irukas leapt off in different directions. Iruka was using the smallest amount of chakra he could to jump through the trees, making small quick leaps from branch to branch. He had 2 Chunin after him, which Iruka hoped meant they had split up equally to chase him. Iruka flipped around, jumped back towards the Chunin, and hit one in the solar plexus. The Chunin doubled over Iruka's fist. Iruka landed neatly on a branch several feet below, and watched the uninjured Chunin, who had a scar across his neck, grab his comrade before he hit the ground. Iruka dodged a punch aimed at his head and tried to sweep the scarred Chunin's legs out from under him. The Chunin dodged and threw a handful of shuriken at Iruka. Iruka rolled under them and slammed into the scarred Chunin's legs. The Chunin fell. Iruka jumped to his feet and slammed a hand into the scarred Chunin's. Iruka grunted as 3 kunai hit his left arm. The Chunin he'd hit first was now recovering. Iruka jumped back, tripped over the scarred Chunin, and fell. He landed hard on a branch nearly 3 feet down, and quickly rolled to his feet. 3 shuriken skimmed his right leg and lodged firmly in tree. Iruka dropped to the forest floor and fled. He didn't know how much damage the tag had done, but he wasn't about to find out. One of his clones had already vanished, and the second wouldn't last much longer. He'd soon be pursued by the other 4 Chunin. Iruka yanked the kunai from his arm as he ran, blood dripping onto his fingers, and tore some cloth from his sleeve to bandage the cuts. The last thing he needed was to leave a blood trail. He heard something speeding through the canopy and jumped up the nearest tree, not wanting to be caught on the ground while the other shinobi were in the trees. He jumped onto a large branch and nearly ran into the second pair of Chunin. Iruka acted instinctively and kicked the closest Chunin in the ankle, hearing something crunch as the Chunin doubled over. Iruka rose and hit the Chunin's nose with his elbow, making another crunching noise. Iruka swung around the first Chunin and dashed across the branch towards the second Chunin, who was pale-faced and shocked. He aimed a punch at the Chunin's gut, only to throw himself to the side and leap to another tree branch when he recognized the Chunin. Shinji, one of Iruka's first students, drew a kunai and prepared to throw it with a shaking hand. Had he been told that the rogue Chunin he was to pursue was his former sensei? Iruka crouched slightly. He remembered Shinji. As a student, the boy had always had a weak guard on his left side, and if he still did, Iruka would have an easy time beating him. He also remembered Shinji had incredible accuracy with anything thrown, so if Iruka wanted to beat his former student, he'd need to get in close and stay that way. "Do you think you can beat me, Shinji-kun?" Iruka asked slowly as he moved forward. Shinji threw the kunai, and it hit Iruka square in the right shoulder. Iruka gasped and jumped forward, almost tackled Shinji to the tree branch, and pinned the younger Chunin to the tree with a kunai thrust through his flak vest. Iruka leapt higher into the canopy and resumed his run. He now knew one thing: he couldn't fight his former students. He was the one who'd taught them, and he remembered all of the ones who'd become genin. He remembered their flaws and what they were good at, but he couldn't use that knowledge against them. He hadn't run a mission in 6 years, and he was out of shape for a shinobi. He was injured, and 3 of the Chunin chasing him were uninjured. He could hope the other 3 were out of commission, but he couldn't count on it. Iruka leapt again and was met with a shower of kunai and shuriken. He threw up his hands to protect himself and missed the branch he'd been aiming for. He fell. Iruka thought his heart stopped while he fell. Iruka's right arm caught on a branch, and his heart thudded again. He heard and felt a pop in his right shoulder before his hand slipped off the branch and he fell the last few feet, hitting water instead of ground, and narrowly avoiding a mouthful of water. He kicked himself down, away from the surface, and looked up through the mostly clear water. Ripples danced above him, but he couldn't see anyone. He slowly swam backwards, struggling to go smoothly while his right arm no longer responded. The water stung the deeper cuts on his arm and an unnoticed cut on his forehead. Iruka's back hit a rock, which turned out to be part of a bank. He used the rock to help pop his shoulder back into place, trying hard not to gasp as the pain flared and died. Iruka dodged another shower of kunai, rolling across the water's surface. He needed to get off the water and onto firm ground where he could conserve chakra. Another shower of kunai sent him further out onto the water. A Chunin fell from the trees and dashed across the water towards Iruka. Iruka recognized him as he dashed across the water, but Iruka hadn't fought him yet, implying the man was unharmed. So Iruka jumped back. Kisuk, the Chunin, was on him in seconds, and Iruka struggled to block the flurry of blows. His feet kept sinking into the water, despite the fact that walking on water was one of the first things he'd ever been taught. Iruka received a glancing blow to his temple, which sent him staggering and made his head spin. Iruka scrambled away, his feet sinking deeper into the water. Another shinobi, a Kanachi, had dropped onto the surface of the water, but she was keeping her distance. Iruka barely avoided another blow to the head, his hands desperately forming signs. He wasn't sure what jutsu he was attempting, but he had to do something. Iruka jumped back from Kisuk, and the water beneath them lurched. Iruka's hands were clumsily working their way through signs Iruka only half remembered. His father's voice was speaking calmly in his mind, but Iruka couldn't concentrate on the words. The water in front of Iruka suddenly leapt to life, blocking Iruka's view of the two other Chunin. Iruka's hands slipped into one more seal, and the wall of water crashed down, blinding him with spray and deafening him with the sound of the crashing water. Then there was silence and no more shinobi. Iruka floundered to the shore, dragged himself out of the water, and made it 5 steps before collapsing, blood streaming into his eyes from the cut on his forehead, his entire body covered in small cuts and gashes. But he was still alive. He couldn't move, but he was alive. For now, Iruka struggled to stand, but he could only roll over a few times. His legs were past the point where burning could describe how they felt. His heart was pounding hard, and his lungs were burning. His arms were useless. Dead? Alright, if anyone saw us. There's the one they were looking for. Why would a Konoha shinobi pursue him? Isn't he also Konoha? The Hittite says he is, but that doesn't mean he is. Heh, do you think someone else is after it as well? And skeptical, Iruka opened his eyes a slit and saw the legs of 2 people standing near him. He didn't recognize their voices. One sounded familiar, but the other didn't. The familiar voice had a Konoha accent, while the other didn't. It's still alive, the unknown voice said as it approached. Perhaps we should. Iruka whipped his legs up and caught a leg, jerked with one leg, pushed with the other, and received a very satisfying crack for his efforts, followed by a thump and a bout of swearing that finally identified the voice's accent. He was from Kirigaki. Something sharp was suddenly pressed against Iruka's neck. If you want to live, you'd better not move again and answer my questions, the familiar voice said. Iruka opened his eyes to meet a pair of red ones that were narrowed. You should know the answer to that without asking me, Itachi. Iruka coughed, a wry smile breaking out on his face. You should probably put your friend's knee back in place before it swells. Iruka's red eyes narrowed, and her world went black. The first thing Iruka noticed was a full body ache that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. The second was that he was tied up very tightly and leaning against a tree. His arms were tied to his sides down to his elbows, and his wrists were tied behind his back to the opposite elbow. His legs were tied straight in front of him at his knees to ankles, but he wasn't blindfolded or gagged. Someone cackled, "Ah, you're awake," and something was forced between Iruka's lips, and a hot liquid slid down his throat. Iruka spluttered and coughed, turned his head, and nearly fell over in shock when he saw the man sitting next to him. "Is that how you treat the person who saved you?" snarled the blue-faced fish man at Iruka. "I'm sorry," Iruka croaked, clearing his throat and continuing. "But to what do I owe the honor of being saved and tied to a tree? Same-san." "Same-san, I like that," the fishman, who spoke with a Kirigaki accent, said, his teeth clenched. "You're here to answer our questions," Itachi said as he descended from the trees. "I'll assume you're intelligent enough to understand what will happen if you refuse to answer our questions. Who are you, and are you a true leaf shinobi?" "I'd say that's a stupid question, but Same-sen has a very nasty-looking kunai in his hand," Iruka coughed. "I am, was a leaf shinobi, and you should know that." Iruka coughed again. "We were on the same genin team." Itachi's eyes narrowed, and the fishman cast a speculative glance at Iruka, saying, "That's how he knew your name." Itachi crouched down by Iruka and casually flipped a kunai into his hand. "If we were on a genin team together." "Yes, we were. You, me, Geku Heiate, and Genma-sensei," Iruka said, "and you look a lot better with hair. Why were you being chased by leaf shinobi?" Itachi twitched, and the fish man snorted. Itachi gave Iruka a look that said he finally knew who Iruka was, and he wasn't happy about it. "It's a long and complicated story," Iruka said, his words slurring together, his mind limp, almost as if he were drunk or poisoned. We have all day if that's how long your story will take, Oikawa-chan. The fish man said, his teeth gleaming. They were chasing me because I wouldn't help them kill Naruto, Iruka explained as he slid down the tree. Itachi and the fish man exchanged glances as Itachi swung his kunai in a slow circle. Isn't he the Kyuyubi's prison? Vessel's a better word now, but that's him, Iruka mumbled, drooling. The Kyuyubi got loose, somehow. I don't think it was Naruto's fault, I know it wasn't. He couldn't possibly mess up Yondame's seal. They want to kill Naruto in the hopes of eliminating the Kyuyubi. But Naruto is still alive. The Kyuyubi were in charge, but Naruto was still present. I can't let them murder him. There was silence, and Iruka wished he could wipe the spit dribbling down his chin. What was he drooling about? He hadn't drooled since breaking his jaw years before. Do you think Naruto could regain control of his body? Itachi asked casually, which Iruka remembered all too well. Itachi was paying close attention because of the lazy I'm not interested tone. Why not? Naruto's still alive somewhere in his body, which means he could regain control if the Kyuyubi was suppressed sufficiently. I believe, Iruka mumbled. The kid would have to be pretty tenacious to coexist with the Kyuyubi in its current state, the fish man pondered. Iruka laughed. Naruto is nothing if not persistent. He never, ever gives up. Itachi and Fishman exchanged another look, and Iruka had the impression they were communicating through telepathy or hand signs. Iruka turned his head to look at their hands, but his head flopped forward onto his chest. The Fishman gently yanked Iruka's head up, allowing Iruka to feel the power of the fish grip. Mans, you've been very helpful, Oikawa-chan. But why didn't you go back to Konoha and tell them Naruto and the Kyuyubi were still coexisting? Because they already knew, grumbled Iruka. That's why they wanted me to lure him out. The Kyuyubi wouldn't come to me, but Naruto would. Naruto trusts me. And they were going to. Iruka became dizzy with rage. They lied to me and said Naruto was dead, almost tricking me into. There wasn't a strong enough word to describe what they'd almost forced him to do. He'd almost betrayed Naruto's faith in him. Naruto trusted him as if he were a brother, a parent. If Iruka had betrayed that confidence, Itachi pressed. So Naruto trusts you and will do what you say. He came when I called and left when I told him to, Iruka mumbled now. Kyuyubi didn't eat me on sight, Itachi and the fish man said again. Iruka knew the fish grip man's on his hair was the only thing keeping his head up. You drugged me with truth serum, Iruka began as he looked at Itachi. Itachi's mouth twitched. My apologies, but you've been very helpful, Iruka, but now you're going to rest. Kisama let his head down. The fish man dropped Iruka's head, and Iruka's chin dropped to his chest. It was more difficult to breathe that way, but Iruka was falling unconscious again, so it was difficult to worry about breathing. Iruka was unbound when he awoke, but he ached all over. Nothing appeared to be broken, which was remarkable. Iruka slowly opened his eyes to find the fish man across from him, a massive sword propped beside him. The fisherman smiled. Are you awake again, Oikawa-chan? Have you had any good dreams? The fish man inquired. None, Iruka replied as he sat up slowly. His hair was loose and falling into his face. He raised his left hand slowly to push his hair behind his ear. He was relieved to discover that his left arm was nearly normal. Iruka was aware that he'd been robbed of his few remaining weapons, and he was a sorry collection of bruises and cuts. He was at the mercy of the fish man and Itachi. He gave the fisherman a calculating look. Should I assume I'm still useful because you haven't eaten me yet, Same-san? That depends on what you do, said the fisherman. I would have eaten you yesterday. But Itachi thinks you'll be useful, Oikawa-chan. Can you still be useful? If it keeps me alive, I'll try, Iruka countered, brushing his hair back from his face. How does Itachi think I can help? Shrugged the fisherman. That depends on whether you're willing to work with us or not, Itachi said as he descended from the trees once more. We appear to have a common goal, and working together will help us both. Do we share a goal? Iruka's brows rose toward his hairline. It was excruciating. And what exactly is that? Regaining control of Naruto's body, Itachi said as he sat down and looked Iruka in the eyes. Itachi's eyes were a normal dark gray, which was a relief. Iruka smirked. That's my goal, but why is it yours? Shouldn't you be trying to free the Kyuyubi or something? Kisama and Itachi exchanged glances before Itachi spoke again. No, we aren't. Our main goal isn't the same as yours, but we want Naruto to regain control of his body rather than the Kyuyubi. It will make our job easier in the long run. Iruka turned to face his former teammate, then the fish man. If he refused, he would most likely be killed or imprisoned. Iruka knew he couldn't compete with Itachi as he was, and he could bet on Fishman being just as strong as Itachi. How long could you survive on your own, Oikawa-chan? The fish man asked, a predatory grin on his face. When he found you, you were in pretty bad shape. That was correct, and Iruka knew he'd need a few days to recover. His chakra remained dangerously low, and he was covered in wounds, minor wounds, but wounds nonetheless. Acceptance was the obvious choice, but could he put his trust in them? Was he given a choice? Itachi had killed his entire clan, and he was not offering a temporary alliance for the sake of old times. He and Iruka had been at best indifferent to each other while they were genin together, and they had lost touch shortly after returning to Konoha from the Chunin exam. Itachi was staring at Iruka without blinking, and the fish man appeared to be about to bite him. Iruka inhaled deeply and idly rubbed the scar across his face. They had treated his injuries and kept him alive. They had also given him truth serum. Do I have much of a choice? Iruka propped his chin in his hand, trying to appear relaxed. Oh, you do? Itachi said softly. I mean, I don't have a fair choice. It's either working with you or having same-sense stir-fry my major organs, Iruka countered. The fisherman chuckled. Itachi cast a calming glance at the fisherman. Will you then collaborate with us? Iruka wished he could keep both shinobi in his sights at the same time. How do I know I can rely on you? The fisherman laughed. Because we need you for current Konoha information, and the Kyuubi seems to like you, and if there's a man-eating beast on the loose, it's best to be on its side. The fishman meant he could trust them as long as Iruka was useful. That was wonderful. How do you know you can put your trust in me? You're in a desperate situation, and Konoha will never take you back. You'll be dead in a matter of days if we don't try to kill Naruto, and you're not likely to betray us, Itachi explained calmly. He gave Iruka a half-closed expression. How long have you been chafing under the restraints Konoha imposed on you? That's not why I left, exclaimed Iruka. He felt himself bristle and wondered if Itachi wasn't at least partially correct. You left because you felt betrayed first, even though it was for the greater good of Konoha, ni. Itachi sat calmly in his crouch, watching Iruka. Iruka's fingers twitched, and he wished he had a kunai in his hand. He felt naked, trapped, and exposed. No shinobi enjoyed those emotions. Iruka took a deep breath. All right, I accept your offer, and we'll work together for the time being. Itachi nodded as the fishman smiled. All right, and my partner's name is Kisame. A fitting name, same-san, Iruka said, smiling. I'm Yumino Iruka, and I suppose I'm now at your service. I still think we should have used you for stir-fry. I haven't had a good one in months, Kisame grumbled, and for some reason, that comment relaxed Iruka rather than made him nervous. Kisame could tell Itachi was thinking something. His face was expressionless, and his eyes were half-lidded. He appeared to be about to sleep, but he was actually deep in thought. He was probably recalling everything he'd ever heard or seen about Yumino Iruka. Itachi's mind was like a library, and it was vast. Itachi didn't leave anything out. Yumino Iruka was sound asleep. The Chunin had fallen into a death-like sleep due to his wounds, nearly depleted chakra, and the stress of the previous 2 days. Of course, the drugs Itachi had used to flavor Chunin's food were probably helping. The drugs were purely medicinal and beneficial, but no shinobi preferred to sleep drugged. Itachi had given the drugs without consulting the Chunin in order to avoid a pointless argument. Were you bluffing earlier, or do you really believe we can trust him? Kisame inquired of his companion. Itachi took a while to respond. Yes, we can. He was a little idiotic but honest, and his reasons make sense unless he's had a drastic change of character. And if he's still a teacher, he probably taught the Kyuubi's vessel. Is he a teacher? Kisame inquired of the Chunin. He's avoided ANBU and Chunin for 2 days, and he's just a Konoha's academy teacher. Itachi appeared hazy. It had something to do with the fact that he incapacitated a Hyuga on our first day back in Konoha after the Chunin exam. Not his incompetence. Our Jounin instructor took us out to drink to celebrate, and as a result, Iruka was permanently stuck as a Chunin and made a teacher, and I didn't see or hear much of him after that. So, will I be dealing with 2 of Konoha's rogue prodigies? Kisame wondered. No, Iruka was a below-average student whose only redeeming quality was his ability to make plans on the fly, Itachi explained. He mostly let me and our other teammate do the fighting. Or he ran by and distracted people while he ate and I snuck up behind them. Our Jounin sensei didn't have time to teach us anything other than basic Konoha training. Kisame laughed. As simple but effective as they are, I sometimes believe Konoha is only great because of its clans. Itachi's lips twitched in what appeared to be a smile. His half-lidded eyes swirled red as he watched the sleeping Chunin. The plan remains the same, ni. We regain control of the kid's body and then return to headquarters with him. Should we kill Oikawa-chan before we leave? Kisame chuckled. We'll have to. Once we regain control of Naruto's body, our goals diverge. He wants to keep the boy alive, while we don't. All we have to do to keep him our ally is keep him from knowing what will happen once we have Naruto, Itachi explained almost blandly. He was only paying half attention to the conversation, But that was all that was required of him. Itachi's mind was rarely focused on one thing at a time, but when it was terrifying. In the meantime, we'll extract as much information about Konoha as we can from him. Kasama chuckled, and Itachi nodded slightly forward. His eyes were only partially open, but they were glowing red beneath his dark lashes. Kasama continued to laugh. Itachi was a cat if he was a shark. The minnow they caught had better keep an eye on his back, or he'd end up being eaten to satisfy the predator's appetite. Shikamaru appeared to be sulking, but he wasn't. He was dissatisfied with his current assignment, but there was nothing he could do about it. He knew there was nothing his team of 5 genin and himself could do to stop the Kyuubi. They'd be lucky if they never saw the Kyuubi, because if they did, they'd be dead. Shikamaru examined his team and thought it was ragtag and pitiful. Only Kiba, who was already 13 and growing quickly, appeared ready for and capable of dealing with any kind of action. Chaoji appeared bored and a little scared. Hinata was terrified, but she tried to hide it. Though Shikamaru was terrified, Ino stood with her hands on her hips as if she owned the woods, and Shikamaru had long given up trying to figure out what the Aburame was thinking. Under his bangs, glasses, and coat, the boy's expression was obscured. Shikamaru wouldn't be surprised if Shino didn't have any eyes. Shikamaru sighed and frowned at his teammates. We'll split into 2 teams of 3 for this, and each team will have a 2-mile stretch of woods to patrol. Don't go too deep into the woods, and try to keep Konoha's walls in sight. We'll meet back here every 3 hours, and after dark we're done. The Kyuubi's chakra glows in the dark, and the guards on the wall can see it. Me, Chaoji, and Hinata will take the left side of the woods, while Shino, Kiba, and Ino will take the right side, Shikamaru said, holding up his hand to halt the debate. Shino is second in command after me, and the leader of the second team. Why should we split up our old genin cells? We'll work better as a team if we stick to what we know, Ino almost whined. No one seemed to mind that Shino was now second in command. In fact, Kiba seemed pleased. Shikamaru folded his hands together and sighed again. Each team requires a member who can detect unusual chakra. Hinata can smell it and Akamaru can see it. That's the only reason I'm dividing us up this way. Shikamaru continued, if you see the Kyuubi, don't fight it, instead, run. Send 2 people here to warn the guards, and another to the wall. We can't compete with the Kyuubi. Hinata gulped, and Akamaru growled. Proceed with caution if you see any other strange creatures, and send a runner to the wall. Avoid unnecessary confrontations with anything in the woods, as a fight may attract the Kyuubi. If you get into trouble, blow the whistle and the other team will come to your aid. Got it. Shikamaru surveyed his team once more. Wakata, Shino replied, my Kaikai bugs may also be able to detect the Kyuubi. That's good. Shikamaru sighed again. This is so annoying. Someone has to do it, Kiba grumbled, and Akamaru continued to growl. The last thing is this, if you see Yumino Iruka, send a runner to the wall and have the other 2 watch him until reinforcements arrive. Shikamaru didn't like those orders. He couldn't believe his former sensei would desert, but orders were orders. The Chunin hadn't returned from his mission to help kill the Kyuubi, and there'd be no need for an elaborate cover story if he'd just been killed. None of the others seemed to like the orders either, and they all remembered Iruka fondly. He'd been their teacher for almost the entire 4 years they'd been at the academy, and it had been difficult to dislike the quick-tempered sensei. All right then, let's go, Shikamaru said, breaking everyone out of their own dark thoughts. Meet back here in 3 hours. There was a chorus of highs, and the 6 shinobi dashed off into their respective teams and formations. Shinobi were very clean people. Sweat and unwashed humans had a very heavy and distinctive odor that made sneaking up on people impossible, so shinobi had to be very clean. But they washed with specially scented soap that wouldn't be noticeable. Each village supposedly had its own heavily guarded soap recipe, which allowed the village shinobi's scent to match the place he was going to spend the most time in. But a shinobi. Iruka was scrubbing his stinging half-healed cuts with Konoha soap provided by Itachi. Iruka and his 2 companions, for lack of a better word, were bathing in one of the deeper streams of the forests. More specifically, Iruka and Kasama were bathing while Itachi kept watch. Iruka dunked his head under water and scrubbed at his hair, wincing as soap got into the cut on his forehead. He came up and scrubbed his head some more, filthy after 2 days of running for his life. Kasama casually grabbed the soap from Iruka and Iruka didn't protest. Kasama, Iruka discovered, was a scaly blue all over and had gills, which Iruka wished he had as a small child. Kasama was also powerfully built and looked very intimidating, especially when he was next to Itachi. How did you and Sam-san become friends, Itachi? Iruka inquired, inspecting a few of his deeper cuts. You can stop calling him Sam-san, Itachi said calmly, resembling a sunbathing cat. I call him Same-san because I have a lot of respect for him, Itachi, Iruka said with a smile. And I call you Oikawa-chan because I want to eat your organs in stir-fry, Kisame retorted with a sharp grin and a chuckle. Iruka laughed, and he knew it was almost mad, more of a cackle. How did you come across a missing nin from Kirigakure? Iruka pressed, having noticed the two had matching cloaks and hats, which probably meant the two were from the same group of something, perhaps a group of S-class missing nin, which was a chilling thought. We met a few years ago, and yes, we are a part of a small group of like-minded individuals. Itachi had his eyes closed, despite the fact that he was supposed to be keeping watch, and Iruka doubted anyone could sneak up on Itachi even with his eyes closed. Knowing there's a group of people who think like you and Same-san will certainly help me sleep tonight, Iruka remarked dryly. That or the drugs you slipped me. Rest assured, that was a one-time thing, Itachi said, opening his eyes slightly and looking at Iruka. If you don't exhaust your chakra to that extent again, you won't need to sleep as deeply to recover. Iruka laughed. You are useful, but you are weak. Your fighting skills are not on my or Kisame's level, and if you're weakened you become a danger to me and Kisame. We need you to be at your best to mitigate the danger that your weakness creates, Itachi explained dryly. Wow, you should give motivational speeches, Itachi. Iruka went underwater once more to make sure he'd gotten all the soap off himself. He came up pushing his hair back from his face. He climbed out of the stream to begin the slow process of drying off without a towel. Itachi had managed the feat quickly, but he had probably used some sort of jutsu. Iruka didn't have chakra to use on something like that. So, Oikawa-chan, what can you tell us about the recent happenings in Konoha? Kisame asked as he too came out of the water. The fishman flicked his hands through a few signs and the excess water fell off him. The Kyuubi got loose and ate some people, Iruka replied. No one had actually been eaten, but a lot of people had died trying to stop the Kyuubi. Iruka felt cold despite the warm sun beating down on him. The last 6 months had been terrible. He'd been teaching crash course lessons to get children graduated from the academy quickly, and he'd hated it. He knew half the children he'd been teaching would die during their first few months on duty. There was simply no way to get the children ready that quickly. Genin with 4 solid years of training and restricted to low-risk missions still got killed. Genin with less than 2 years of rushed training forced into higher-risk missions would get slaughtered. Iruka had been preparing those children for a bloody, painful death, and he'd hated every second of it. Cold, scaly hands touched Iruka's bare back, making him almost jump back into the stream. Water jumped off Iruka's skin and hair to the ground, leaving Iruka dry. Iruka glanced back and saw Kisame grinning at him. The fishman had a very alarming grin. How did the Kyuubi get loose? Itachi pressed, his eyes closed and his voice almost dreamy. Iruka wasn't fooled. The Uchiha was paying close attention to everything that was happening. I don't know, but I'm going to find out, Iruka replied. He grabbed his clothes, which were more accurately the clothes he'd borrowed from Itachi and Kisame, and began pulling them on. The best way to do that is going back to Konoha and finding out if there's a record of where Naruto was when the Kyuubi got loose. Kisame grumbled something about paper pushers, and Itachi made a vaguely approving noise. Iruka began pulling his hair back into its normal ponytail. He reached automatically for his Hidayate and froze when it caught the sun. This Hidayate was practically new. Iruka had gotten it just over a year ago after he'd given his old one to Naruto. Iruka's heart clenched when he remembered Naruto's beaming face when Iruka had handed over his Hidayate. Iruka's hand tightened around the metal band of his Hidayate as his thoughts turned to darker memories. The first day the Kyuubi had gotten loose came vividly to Iruka's mind. Kakashi had been the one to tell him. Iruka, despite the sick feeling in his gut he hadn't felt since his parents' death, had finished teaching his class before running down to see the damage. Buildings had been blown up. There was an enormous patch of destruction that led outside of Konoha into a path of forest. The bodies, both dead and injured, had already been cleared away. Most people had gotten away with nightmares, broken bones, and burns, but some had died, either from the Kyuubi's demonic chakra or the Kyuubi's claws. Iruka hadn't thrown up, but he'd gone numb. This was too much like the first Kyuubi attack for him. Certainly the destruction was less and the area smaller, but the smell in the air, and the tang in Iruka's mouth almost sent his mind straight back to when he'd searched the ash-strewn ground for any sign of his parents so many years ago. Part of him had almost died right there when he saw the wreckage and knew the Kyuubi was loose and Naruto was lost. When he'd seen the delicate pink-haired body covered in a pale blood-stained sheet, part of him had died, or gone to sleep. The months after that were a dark blur filled with repetition. Thinking back, Iruka was amazed by how much he'd relied on those repetitions to get him through the days. Until he'd been asked to help kill the Kyuubi, his life had centered on his students, which was a bitter, heartbreaking thing to consider. Iruka traced the leaf design on the headband. It was a symbol of Konoha's shinobi. It was a symbol Iruka had lived and fought under for 10 years now, and now he had tossed it away. Iruka looked at Itachi's Hidaite. The same leaf symbol gleamed at him, but it was marred with the mark of a missing nin. Iruka drew his thumbnail across the middle of the leaf symbol and was momentarily blinded as the sun glinted off the metal and into his eyes. "Oi, Oikawa-chan," Kasame called. Iruka looked up and folded his Hidaite up. He tucked it into his pocket and stood up. He knew he'd never wear his leaf Hidaite again, but he wasn't ready to throw it away just yet. Kakashi Hatake was not a philosophical man. He believed in what he could see, hear, taste, feel, and smell. His life as a shinobi had taught him that was the best way to live. In his experience, gods and demons never granted favors to mortal men, and relying on them to do so was pointless and dangerous. A shinobi could only trust himself and his comrades. Of course, there would always be the comrades who betrayed their fellows. Traitors among shinobi were not common creatures in Konoha, but they were about. There was always some ambitious fool who would be willing to betray his village for personal gain. Kakashi sat crouched in front of the hero's stone and let his eye trail down the familiar list of names. His eye paused on Obaido's name, as it always did. There were many Uchiha on the stone, but Obaido was the only one that mattered to Kakashi. Inuzuka, Aburame, Hyuga, and Uchiha were names that appeared regularly across the stone. Kakashi passed them over rather slowly. He hadn't personally known more than a double handful of the shinobi on the stone, but he knew far too many of the names on the stone by reputation or word of mouth. Kakashi stood and prepared to leave. He gathered himself up and paused. He let his feet carry him away from the hero's stone to a smaller stone covered all over with names. There were several old offerings around the stone, even though it commemorated people who had been dead for a while now. This little monument had been erected to honor all the civilians and non-shinobi medics who had died during the Kyuubi's attack. The names were in alphabetical order, and Kakashi found the two names he was looking for quickly. Tako Yamino, Haido Yamino. There was nothing to say that the two had been married, but they had been. They had also left a lonely orphan named Iruka who had become a shinobi. The two had been killed by the Kyuubi, and now their son was trying to save the Kyuubi. If one did not add Naruto to the equation, it sounded like Iruka had gone mad, but maybe he actually had. The Kyuubi had been in control for too long, and Naruto could never go back to being the janky kid he had been. Kakashi's left arm suddenly hurt. It was an annoying twinge at first, but it steadily grew. Kakashi grabbed his left arm in his right and gritted his teeth. It felt like fire was consuming his arm. It felt like teeth were tearing flesh from bone. It felt like claws were scratching deep grooves into the bone. "Kakashi-sensei." A calm, cold voice spoke, and Kakashi was glad his back was turned to the speaker. He couldn't control the twitches in his face that gave away his pain. He waited for a few moments while the pain died down to a bearable sensation and turned. Kakashi knew the boy's eyes had always been cold and black, at least they had been since his clan's death. But now there was something about them that made Kakashi tense. He'd seen eyes like that in the face of a seasoned ANBU, but never in the face of a 13-year-old boy. "Sasuke-kun, glad you could join me." Kakashi turned to face his one remaining student and tucked his left hand into his pocket. "A new mission, I suppose." Missions were a constant. Even now Konoha ran missions, perhaps fewer than 6 months ago, but money was still coming in. "Hi." Sasuke held out a scroll. They said it shouldn't take more than a week, by the end of which Iruka Yamino would be caught. Kakashi was sure. "Well, let's get going." Kakashi walked away from the hero's stone, leaving behind only the faint smell of incense. Iruka felt a surge of chakra as the creature bore down on him. It wasn't the Kyuubi's chakra, but it wasn't a shinobi's either. Iruka threw himself backwards and up as something crashed into the ground where he'd been moments ago. Iruka couldn't make out any details about the thing but that it was hairy and had far too many teeth and claws before it leapt towards him. It was definitely some sort of animal. Iruka threw a handful of kunai at the creature, but that only made it madder. Iruka jumped back again, his sore, tired muscles screaming in protest. The creature turned, its fang-filled mouth open to emit a hissing growl. Iruka's foot crunched in the fallen leaves, and he wondered where Kasame and Itachi were. The creature lunged and jumped. Iruka crouched to roll, but something caught him, yanked him down, and held him still. Something else blurred in front of him seconds before the creature landed on him, and blood rained down on Iruka. He clamped his eyes and mouth shut and heard the creature's body fall to the ground. "What is it?" Kasame asked with a mild curiosity. Iruka's body came back under his control, and he began wiping blood from his face. "A tanuki, perhaps." Itachi responded in a way that made it clear he wasn't sure. Iruka opened his eyes and saw the two missing nin standing by the creature. Kasama's sword was bloody, and the creature, which did look a little like a tanuki, was missing its throat. I guess the Kyubai's chakra really is badly affecting the wildlife. Iruka almost laughed as he clambered slowly to his feet. You didn't tell us that. Itachi's voice was bland, but his red eyes were flashing and spinning. I didn't know the Kyubai's chakra was turning the other creatures into demons. Iruka replied as he wiped more blood off his face. What did you do to me? Kage main no jutsu, Itachi responded airily, as if it should have been obvious. Perhaps it had been. There was no telling how many different jutsu Itachi had stored in the genius brain of his. Iruka winced as he noticed the burning feeling that was starting almost everywhere the blood was touching him. It was especially strong along the cut across his scalp. Just my luck, the blood is caustic, and I have more scrapes and cuts than a kid with his first kunai, Iruka grumbled. With your luck, that blood will infect your wounds, and you'll die painfully when they turn septic. Itachi blinked and his eyes began fading back to gray. You should wash it off. The blood burns, eh? Kasama looked intrigued. How much does it burn, Oikawa-chan? Not enough to be crippling, but too much to ignore. Iruka resisted the urge to scratch his scalp where the burning was the worst. I think I'll take Itachi's advice and wash this stuff off before it gets any worse. Itachi's hands blurred, and a clone of the Uchiha appeared. The clone can go with you. I want to look at this thing some more. Iruka nodded and set off back to the three's camp. Iruka carefully dispelled the genjutsu and undid the traps around Itachi's pack before grabbing the soap and heading back to the stream he bathed in that morning. Itachi's clone followed him. Iruka kept glancing at the clone, which was making him nervous. If he ran into trouble, Itachi's clone would be a big help, but it still made Iruka nervous. Iruka dropped his uniform jacket on the stream bead and simply waded into the stream with the bloody clothes on. He pulled the hairband out of his hair as he ducked underwater and scrubbed at the blood in his hair. The slow-moving stream helped to pull some of the almost fresh blood out of his hair. It took Iruka a while to get all the burning blood off of himself and his borrowed clothes. Iruka stepped out onto the bank and saw Itachi's clone leaning against a tree watching him. Iruka stuck his tongue out at the clone and flopped back onto the leaf-covered floor. He stared up into the bare tree branches, the bar of soap still loosely held in his hand. He wished there were leaves on the branches. When there had been leaves on the branches, things had been better. Iruka suddenly sat up, and his mouth went dry. Chakra flared suddenly into existence. It was horribly strong chakra that brought a metallic taste to Iruka's mouth as soon as he sensed it. It pressed down on Iruka's senses and seemed to smother him. Itachi's clone disappeared as soon as the chakra touched it. Iruka's eyes fell on the opposite bank of the stream and he saw the Kyuubi. It caught him with a burning red stare and approached. Iruka hadn't been able to move since the red eyes had caught his. He could barely breathe as the Kyuubi's chakra was directed towards him. His senses felt compressed. His body broke out in a cold sweat, and his mouth was dry and filled with a metallic taste almost like blood. The Kyuubi glided forward, walking on the water as if it were land. The water steamed as the Kyuubi stepped on it. Iruka gagged as the Kyuubi's smell rolled over him. It added a musty taste to his mouth that was nauseating. Iruka couldn't move. His muscles were clenched and shaking, and he couldn't move. He could only stare at the advancing Kyuubi and wonder how it was going to kill him. There was nothing else the creature could want with Iruka but to kill him, after all. It moved with a fluid predator's grace, and its teeth and claws were deadly sharp. Chakra filled with bloodlust rolled off it, and it was advancing on Iruka. It stepped easily onto the bank not a foot in front of Iruka's feet and sat watching him. Its tails danced gently around it. It kept its steady red gaze on Iruka and flexed its claws. The ground it touched charred, and the leaves disintegrated. Iruka could guess at what a touch of the demon would do to him. Iruka tried to pull back as the Kyuubi slid closer and wondered if he had been wrong all along, and this creature really was simply the Kyuubi and nothing else. SS-sensei, the Kyuubi almost purred as it stopped only inches from Iruka. Iruka S-sensei, it hissed. Iruka kept staring at the red eyes and found the faint band of purple around the iris. He concentrated on that and was able to pull himself up into a crouch. The Kyuubi growled. So, how have you been, Naruto? Iruka asked in a hoarse voice. His mouth and throat were completely dry. I haven't seen you in, what, almost 2 days, right? He was beginning to think he might pass out from the sheer amount of chakra pressing down on him. He felt like each breath he took was burning his lungs. Iruka S-sensei's Huit. The Kyuubi's voice held an odd hissing quality that made distinguishing emotions in it impossible for Iruka. Bleeding. The Kyuubi's eyes flashed. No, not bad, Iruka choked out. Naruto, that is really you talking, right? The Kyuubi smiled, revealing sharp teeth and wicked fangs. It reached forward with a clawed finger and touched Iruka's cheek. Iruka's cheek immediately began to burn. He could feel the chakra eating at his skin. He gasped, and only the Kyuubi's red eyes kept him from moving. "Nah, Naruto, stop. You're hurting me," Iruka managed. The finger pressed harder against his cheek, and the burning continued. Iruka struggled for a moment to find his voice. "Naruto, stop." How he managed to wring his mad teacher voice out of his dry throat he didn't know, but it worked. The Kyuubi jerked back and the chakra pressing around Iruka diminished. The Kyuubi stared at Iruka with a startled expression, and Iruka felt the weight of the red eyes lifting off him. "Sensei." The hiss was gone from the voice, it was simply breathless. Iruka watched in amazement as the red faded slightly, and the Kyuubi stepped back. "Ruka-sensei." "Yeah, it's me." Iruka felt a smile break across his face, even though it hurt. "How have you been, Naruto?" Kyuubi Naruto hissed and tensed all over. It jerked its head around and Iruka followed the movement with his own head. Iruka whipped his head back around as Kyuubi Naruto jumped away from Iruka and vanished into the trees. "What's going on?" Itachi asked as he landed by Iruka. He held 8 kunai in each fist. Kisama landed heavily next to him. Iruka could feel their chakra, much weaker than the Kyuubi's burning chakra had been. Itachi's burned in an almost comforting way against Iruka's raw senses, and Kisama's chakra felt cold. Kisama had more chakra than Itachi, almost twice as much. Kyuubi, Iruka coughed. His throat and mouth were covered in the horrible taste of the Kyuubi's scent. "And it didn't eat you." Kisama looked impressed, or maybe he was disappointed. Iruka's right eye, the one above his still burning cheek, was watering, making it hard to see the fish expression man's clearly. The salty tears stung the raw skin below it, causing more tears to gather in his right eye. Iruka would have thought he couldn't be more pitiful than when Kisama and Itachi had first found him, but he wasn't so sure anymore. He was drenched in sweat, shaking so hard his teeth were almost chattering. His breathing was coming in fast, erratic gasps, and his pulse was thundering. "He evidently not," Iruka replied to Kisama's incredulous remark. He saw Itachi and Kisama trade discreet glances, and Kisama smirked. Itachi turned his red-eyed gaze on Iruka. Compared to the Kyuubi's eyes, Itachi's eyes were hardly red at all. Iruka giggled. Itachi flicked all his kunai back to wherever they'd come from, and crouched down beside Iruka. His eyes faded to gray as he looked at Iruka's cheek. "You're lucky that's only a 2nd-degree burn. If it was 3rd degree I wouldn't be feeling it." Iruka almost laughed. He stood up in jerky movements and nearly fell down. "I know now. I know he's still there." "What?" Itachi looked up at Iruka with the half-lidded eyes of a half-asleep cat. "I know Naruto's still conscious inside the Kyuubi, and I think it was looking for me," Iruka explained. He braced a hand against a tree and took a few deep breaths. "I need to go back to Konoha and figure out how it happened." He knew he was repeating himself. He had already told Kisama and Itachi he planned to go back to Konoha and search for records of what had happened to Naruto. The 2 missing nin had agreed with his plan. "Next time it rains, Oikawa-chan, we'll go," Kisama chuckled. "Unless you intend to crawl there right now." Iruka shook his head and tried to push his sweat-soaked hair back from his face. It didn't work very well. Itachi stood gracefully and, without words, led the way back to where Kisama and Itachi's bags were. Iruka dropped more than sat down and leaned his back against the tree. His senses were slowly becoming less raw. His sense of Itachi and Kisama's chakra was already fading into what he'd normally be able to feel, which was a relief. He closed his eyes and tried to still his shaking body. His eyes snapped open as Itachi moved towards him. Itachi's hands were flipping slowly through some signs. Iruka's body tensed before he told it to relax, and Itachi raised an eyebrow at him. The Uchiha crouched gracefully beside Iruka and made a few more signs. "For your burn," he explained simply as he reached out a hand. Iruka barely flinched as Itachi's cold skin touched his cheek. If there was anyone who knew about treating burns, it would be a Uchiha. Kiba's nose was raw and it had bled earlier. He rubbed at it and sneezed. Akamaru, tucked away in his shirt despite the fact the puppy was getting too big for it, was having an even worse time with his nose. The dog's nose had been running bloody mucus almost constantly for the past 2 days, and Kiba's nose was about to do the same. After 2 days on border patrol the Kyuubi's forest, the scent of the Kyuubi was beginning to cling to everything, and Kiba was ready to resort to desperate measures to get the scent off. He cast a look to Hinata, and thought the girl was lucky she couldn't smell as well as he or Akamaru could, though she did seem more depressed than she had been before they'd started their patrol. Kiba shifted Akamaru around and the dog poked his head out of Kiba's coat. He whined at Hinata, who was intently studying the ground as they walked. "So, how's working with Choji and Shikamaru?" Kiba asked. He found he missed working with the quiet Hyuga, and Ino was a big change from Hinata's quiet, timid ways. "Oh, they're both very nice, and..." Hinata trailed off and fiddled with the zipper of her coat. Shikamaru is very smart. Kiba snorted, and his nose stung. If he can be motivated to get off his lazy butt and think, Kiba almost growled. It was a playful growl a dog would have used while playing with his litter mates. Hinata fiddled with her zipper some more, and Kiba hoped she was trying not to smile. Ever since the Kyuubi's escape, Hinata's smile had become almost non-existent. Kiba sneezed again, and wiped his nose with the back of his hand. His hand came away bloody. Crap, Kiba grumbled as he felt blood beginning to flow down his lip. Akamaru whined as Kiba searched for something to staunch the flow with. He'd hardly started the search when Hinata handed him a slightly dirty handkerchief. Her brow was furrowed with concern. "Hey, I'll be fine," Kiba said brightly as he held the handkerchief to his nose and leaned his head forward. "Hey, clot well. If you have to keep going out and patrolling the forest, your nose won't get any better," Hinata murmured with a quick glance to Kiba's face. "No, but I'll learn to live with it," Kiba said in what he hoped with a stoic manner. "What about you? Does the forest do anything weird to your Byakugan?" "Yeah." Hinata shook her head. It's a little frightening to be that close to." She trailed off, but Kiba knew what she meant. Even without his keen sense of smell, he would still be on edge after patrolling the edge of a forest with the Kyuubi in it. The fact that the Kyuubi was using the body of one of their former classmates' body only made it worse. Akamaru whined, and Kiba lifted his head. A lone figure was trudging towards them, head down and shoulders hunched. The person smelled of blood and ash, which put Akamaru's hackles up. Kiba could barely smell anything for the blood in his nose, and it took him a while to recognize the person. "Oi, it's Sasuke," Kiba almost yelped. Hinata looked up. Sasuke looked up too. Kiba could see dark circles under his eyes. "Oh, it's you," Sasuke observed as he pulled himself up straighter. Kiba snorted. He knew how tired the other genin was just by looking at him. Sasuke didn't have to act tough in front of Kiba and Hinata, but he did anyway. "Yeah, I've missed you too." Kiba rolled his eyes, and then his expression sobered. "Hey, they put Sakura's name up on the hero's stone. You should go see it. The rest of us genin are going down tomorrow before our patrol starts to light some incense and stuff." Sasuke's face only twitched a bit at the mention of Sakura's name, but he shrugged. "I don't have time. I'm supposed to head back for a new mission tomorrow." "Then go now. It's still light enough to see," Kiba pressed as he stepped toward the Uchiha. "I'll go later," Sasuke replied in a tone that told Kiba he never planned to go at all. If Kiba had possessed hackles, they would have been up. "You should go. She was your teammate, Sasuke," Kiba almost growled. "You risked your lives together, and there's no telling how many times she saved your life. The least you can do is go pay your respects." If there was one thing every Inuzuka knew, it was teammates were pack, and one never forgot them. Sasuke's eyes narrowed, and he snorted. "I don't need anyone." "Oh, I suppose that's why you always get sent on missions with Kakashi," Kiba snarled. Inside his shirt, Akamaru growled. "Or does Great Copy Nin need a crutch?" Sasuke's eyes narrowed and he stepped toward Kiba. His step was threatening, and his body language screamed anger. Kiba bared his fangs at the other genin, and Sasuke lifted his head to better glare down at Kiba. Kiba had an urge to go for the boy's exposed throat. "I hear you're on border patrol across the forest. It's nice to know they're finally throwing something useless out there for the Kyuubi to kill." Sasuke's voice was cold and flat. Kiba felt Hinata flinch and growled. It was a deep, low, dangerous growl that started deep in his chest. Akamaru mirrored the snarl. Kiba's eyes narrowed. "Have you noticed we're all still alive? You know why that is, Sasuke? It's because we work as a team. We don't go off on our own. We don't leave people behind because we think they're slowing us down. We watch out for each other. We don't abandon each other. We don't live alone because we're afraid of people dying. We protect each other." Sasuke moved, and Kiba caught the boy's arm in a bruising grip. Sasuke returned the grip, twisting his arm at an awkward angle. The bones in Kiba's arm grated together. "I don't need anyone. I don't want anyone. I don't need a team. I don't want one," Sasuke spat. "Because you're afraid of losing them again," Kiba countered, tightening his grip on Sasuke's arm. His nails were drawing blood on Sasuke, and the only things keeping the two from blows was the fact Konoha shinobi were not allowed to fight amongst themselves where civilians could see. Kiba wasn't sure even that would be able to hold them back for much longer. He ached to wipe the cold look off Sasuke's face. The boy had always been insufferable, but now he was worse. "Kiba," a gentle hand touched Kiba's shoulder. "Let's go." Hinata's gaze was lowered, and Kiba could feel she was shaking. He hoped she was shaking with anger. Kiba let go of Sasuke and wrenched his hand away. Sasuke pulled back gracefully and smirked. Kiba bit down the words that rose in him and quickly turned to follow Hinata. He could feel a bruise forming on his arm. He growled to himself as he walked down the darkening street. Sasuke was a jerk. It must be terrible to be so alone. Hinata whispered. Kiba stared at her. Akamaru lifted his nose to Kiba's chin and howled. Iruka blocked another blow, and his arms shook. His bruises were bruising, and sweat was dripping off his nose. The blocks were all standard Konoha Taijutsu, and Iruka knew them by heart. Itachi obliged the standard blocks with standard kicks and punches, but the Uchiha was fast. His deceptively small frame was all wiry muscle, and even though he was holding back, Iruka could feel bruises starting up on his arms wherever a blow landed. Kasama sat reclined against a tree, watching with a sharky grin. He had started grinning as soon as Itachi had told Iruka they were going to spar. Itachi's reasoning was that Iruka was a liability to Itachi and Kasama, and if Itachi could make Iruka less of a liability, it would be a good thing. Hence the Uchiha was gauging Iruka's skill. Iruka grunted as a particularly hard punch nearly knocked through his guard. Iruka's shoulder hurt suddenly as the blow landed. Iruka jumped back from Itachi. "Stop, you'll mess up my shoulder again." To say nothing of the new bruises on top of all his old half-healed ones. Itachi relaxed from his stance, and Iruka got the feeling he was being measured. "Did you swallow a Konoha textbook on Taijutsu?" Kasama asked as Iruka lowered himself onto the ground. 4 days had done a lot to heal him and replenish his chakra, but he was still below par. "I have been teaching straight from a textbook for 6 years, same-san," Iruka replied. He didn't have to wonder why Kasama knew those blocks had been straight from a Konoha textbook. If Kasama had fought at least a dozen Konoha shinobi, he would recognize the base they had all built their Taijutsu styles on. Iruka pulled up his sleeve and examined the reddening skin. "I think he's more trouble than he's worth." Itachi, Kasama chuckled. Iruka turned his head to look at the fish man, whose eyes were glinting dangerously. Iruka had first thought that Itachi was the more dangerous of the two, but after feeling how much chakra Kasama had, Iruka wasn't so sure. Itachi was obviously in charge of the planning, and Kasama followed the younger shinobi, but Kasama had more destructive power than Itachi. "We'll loosen him up," Itachi replied blandly. "He's useful enough if the Kyuubi didn't eat him." Iruka absently touched the new scar on his left cheek. It started just under his old scar and spread out and down to his jaw. It wasn't a bad scar, thanks to the use to Itachi's jutsu, but it would be another mark Iruka would bear for the rest of his life. Iruka reached up and absently rubbed his hand over the scar across his nose. It ached, and there was a headache building behind it. Iruka knew that feeling very well. It meant it was going to rain. A thrill raced through Iruka, turning his stomach. He looked up sharply and found both Itachi and Kasama staring at him. "It's going to rain." Itachi's lips quirked, and Kasama laughed. Konoha was a green place, and therefore needed a lot of rain to keep it green. It wasn't unusual for Konoha to get more than an inch of rain a week by means of wild thunderstorms or gentle downfalls of rain. Tonight was something in between those storms. The rain fell hard, but there was no wind or thunder. Iruka raced along behind Itachi with Kasama bringing up the rear. Iruka's heart was pounding, and he felt horribly alive. They were in Konoha, and the city slept around them. Rain had lulled many people to sleep, and now, an hour or two after midnight, the streets were deserted. As they neared shinobi-oriented part of the town, more people would be about, but not many. Their feet hit the rain-slick roofs with hardly a sound, and Iruka knew they were one slip away from discovery, which, in the heart of Konoha, would be death. He shivered not from fear, but from something he couldn't name. Itachi led them by his old memories and maps Iruka had drawn in the dust. They were headed for the Hokage's tower, which was now vacant, but would hold the records they needed. Itachi landed lightly on the side of the tower. Iruka landed crouched beside him. The Uchiha looked at the window beside them and nodded. Iruka formed a few signs and pressed his hands to the window. If he was still keyed into the jutsu that kept this part of the tower locked, their job would be easy. A soft glow surrounded Iruka's hand, and he smiled. There had been too much to do and worry about to change the jutsu, evidently. Maybe it wasn't even known he was keyed into the jutsu. Sandaime himself had done it, and who would think a Chunin Academy teacher would be able to access such sensitive documents? Iruka swung the window open and stepped in. The room was softly lit by the green glow of the emergency light strips around the walls. Iruka formed seals and gently pushed the water off his clothes and hair and back out the window. Kasama and Itachi did the same and waited for Iruka. Iruka took a short breath and moved for the closest filing cabinet. He didn't have a key, but he had a senbon that would do the trick. 2 jutsu, and 5 minutes later Iruka was sorting gently through the scrolls in the cabinet. After a few minutes of looking, he closed it. That wasn't what he was looking for. He moved to another and started the process over again. The documents Iruka leafed through only confirmed what he knew. Konoha was struggling. First there had been the attack by sound, and then the Kyuubi had gotten loose. After the Kyuubi got loose, there was no way to hide how badly Konoha was hurting. The village was openly struggling to keep itself afloat. Iruka found he wasn't very guilty. There was a niggling doubt in the back of his head, but he put it aside. He had made his choice, and he couldn't give up on it. Giving up on that choice would be giving up on Naruto, and he couldn't do that. Iruka was going to save the boy if it killed him, which was likely. Iruka picked up a scroll and frowned at the seal. He slowly eased it open, and the first few words made his heart pound harder. This was it. This was what they had come for. He pulled the scroll open a little more and read the first paragraph quickly. He stopped and read it again. Iruka's hand tightened on the scroll, and his hands shook. Anger boiled up in him, and he swore softly. The world narrowed to the kanji painted onto the scroll in his hands. That was all he could see. Oi, Oikawa-chan, is that what we need? Kasama's voice and hand on Iruka's shoulder dragged his mind away from the words. Yeah, Iruka spat the words out. He nearly whipped around and tried to rip Kasama's arm off when the fish man had touched him. Good, we managed to alert a guard or two. We should leave now, Itachi said. His red eyes almost glowed in the semi-darkness of the room. Iruka, after tucking the scroll into his flak vest, followed Itachi out the window, once again taking the middle position. He was the liability. He was the weak one. He was the one who needed to be protected. Anger churned in Iruka's stomach, and it was fast turning into rage. Itachi was fast, and all Iruka could think about was keeping up with him and the words he had read. He let himself be led and tried to swallow the bitter taste of anger in his mouth. Itachi leapt lightly onto the wall that marked the end of Konoha, and dropped almost 30 feet to the ground with ease. Iruka simply ran down the wall and hit the ground at a speed where one misstep would be death. Kasama still followed behind, his footsteps loud now that stealth was abandoned. They ran across the short stretch of wet grass towards the trees that were the Kyuubi's woods. An ANBU landed in front of Iruka. Iruka barely slowed down before landed a hard punch on the ANBU's chest. He jumped around the ANBU and raced after Itachi, only to find 3 more ANBU between them and the forest. Iruka ducked as a barrage of shuriken and kunai was thrown at them. There were no ANBU behind them, but there was Konoha, which offered nothing but more enemies. They needed to get back into the forest. We're too close to Konoha. We need to get away, Iruka gasped. Itachi nodded, and Iruka suddenly grinned. How big of a fireball can you make? Itachi raised an eyebrow at Iruka, and his hands flashed through seals. Iruka's hands began seals as well. They both remembered this trick from their genin days. Just as Kasama jumped up beside them, a giant fireball appeared and was engulfed in a sudden deluge of water. Steam shot into the air and hissed out in all directions. Iruka jumped into it, remembering the positions on the ANBU, and dashed into the shelter of the trees. Iruka burst through the steam and into the trees. He ran, pushing chakra into his feet and legs. It took him 5 strides to realize he couldn't see Itachi or Kasama. The steam trick had been a little too effective, evidently, but Itachi and Kasama could probably find Iruka easily enough. Iruka should focus on getting deeper into the forest. Iruka threw himself forward as he felt a blow coming at his head. Years of having things thrown at him from behind by mischievous students had given Iruka an excellent sense of something is flying towards my head. He whirled and came to face the ANBU, who was already launching another attack. Iruka dodged and was hit with 2 kunai. He jumped away, but the ANBU stayed right with him. All ANBU were elite, but there were some who were the better than others, the elite of the elite. Iruka had the sinking feeling he was facing one of those now as he received a punch that sent him stumbling back. Iruka was built sturdy with an excellent sense of balance, and that was the only thing that kept him on his feet under the ANBU's barrage of blows. Iruka couldn't attack. He was scrambling to dodge and block, but he was still getting hit hard in places where getting hit was dangerous. If he slipped on the wet leaves, he was dead. If he failed to block one of the more powerful blows, he was dead. This ANBU was not planning on taking Iruka alive. He wanted him dead, and Iruka was about to die before he got Naruto back. Iruka snapped. The anger that he'd been battling down since reading the scroll in his vest boiled out. It rose into something that could only be called fury, and Iruka's solid Konoha defensive form dropped. He rolled chakra into his arms and legs. The ANBU launched a chakra and force strike at Iruka's throat, intending to either behead him or crush his windpipe. The blow didn't land. Iruka grabbed the ANBU's arm, locked his elbow, and threw him. He heard the elbow pop, and watched the ANBU roll to his feet as Iruka descended on him. The ANBU struck again, and Iruka dodged the blow. He was now using chakra to enhance his speed and his power. Iruka grabbed the ANBU and threw him again. The ANBU hit a tree hard, and Iruka heard things break. Oi, Iruka, Heiaku Kit, Itachi shouted as he and Kasama flashed through the trees past Iruka and his ANBU opponent. Iruka waited a second to see the ANBU drop limply to the ground and then leapt after Kasama and Itachi. his mind still clouded with rage and unable to realize what he had just done. The scroll began with a list of jutsu Iruka didn't know. There were complex diagrams of circles and squares and hexagrams that needed to be written with more blood than ink. The scroll went on to detail the operations that the jutsu were for and what had happened. It had been an attempt to bring up Konoha's fire power, and it had failed miserably. The original idea had been to weaken the Kyuubi's seal just enough to give its vessel more of its power. It hadn't worked. In fact, it had blown up spectacularly. The vessel's former genin teammate was standing by to help in case of complications. The vessel was fond of her, and the sight of her should have helped him stay in control. The jutsu were working fine, and everything seemed to be going as planned. The second to last sequence was finished and the last one was beginning. Something went wrong. The Kyuubi's chakra broke completely through Yondame's seal. The Kyuubi then pulled chakra out off all the shinobi connected to the jutsu currently being worked and used it to break through the Yondame's seal. All the shinobi in the room were killed instantly. The Kyuubi then broke out of the room. The genin was chased down and killed in the confusion. Everyone was trying to get away. The Kyuubi smashed through a wall of the building and escaped into the street, leaving death and destruction in his wake. Civilians and shinobi alike were killed, and the Kyuubi escaped into the forest to the east of Konoha. The scroll went on to explain the attempts to recapture the Kyuubi. There had been 2 half-hearted attempts to squeeze the Kyuubi back into Naruto, but neither had come close to working. There were another 12 accounts of attempts to kill Naruto and the Kyuubi. The scroll was heavy with Konoha secrets, but Iruka was too infuriated to fully realize how many secrets the scroll contained. As a final effort, we will try to lure the Kyuubi into a death trap using Umino Iruka, former teacher of the Kyuubi's vessel. The Kyuubi's vessel still has some consciousness left, and using a person he trusts will, hopefully, keep him from being mauled or killed as others have been. Umino Iruka is to be told nothing about the Kyuubi's vessel's semi-conscious state, as he was fond of the Kyuubi's vessel to prevent complications. Complications? Huh? Iruka thought bitterly as he thought of the words. He'd read the whole scroll through twice now, and each time he got madder. The Grand Council had ordered Naruto's seal to be broken in an attempt to get some sort of super shinobi, and now the whole village was suffering. Iruka was so mad he was shaking. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been so mad. Iruka stood up abruptly and began pacing. Itachi was reading over the scroll with red-tinted eyes. Kasama had perused the scroll and left it to Itachi to dig any deeper meaning out of it. The restless pacing didn't really help, but Iruka couldn't sit still anymore. He wanted to do something. He wanted to fix everything right now. He didn't want to flounder around helpless anymore. Naruto had been betrayed by Konoha. Iruka had been betrayed by Konoha. Konoha had betrayed itself. Iruka turned sharply and found Kasama watching him intently. Iruka's body tensed. For a moment Kasama was a threat, and Iruka was ready to fight him. Iruka forced himself to relax a bit and took a few more steps. Pacing was not helping him calm down and think. Same. Iruka almost winced at how abruptly his voice rang out, and at how it shook. Would you spar with me? Kasama raised his head a bit and looked past Iruka before looking at him. Iruka looked back, his body trying to twitch itself into all sorts of forms to protect itself from the attack that was to come, or strike before the attack came. Iruka could also feel Itachi looking at him. Sure, Oikawa-chan. Kasama grinned his predatory grin as he stood up and propped his sword up against a tree. Just a jutsu. Ah, Iruka replied as he stepped closer to Kasame. He let his body tense and knew his eyes were wide. He watched Kasama closely, but he almost missed the fish-first man's strike. It was a hard blow that jarred Iruka's bones. He couldn't block it completely, and instead stepped aside and let the blow slide past him. Kasama rounded on him again, and Iruka had no time to think. Kasama fought with Kiriga's flowing taijutsu, and faced with that Iruka began to revert from Konoha's solid stances to something else. After the first few strikes, Iruka stopped thinking and just fought. There was a flow to battle. Even friendly sparring matches had flows to them. Iruka fell into that flow, and let it wash him away. Neither Iruka nor Kasama were using chakra, but the sparring match was getting faster and the blows were getting harder. Iruka flowed through forms his mind had almost forgotten, but his body remembered perfectly. There was a response embedded in Iruka's reflexes for each attack and block Kasama used, and if Iruka didn't think they came easily, Iruka, on a moment of pure luck, grabbed Kasama's elbow, locked it, and, somehow, managed to throw the larger shinobi to the ground. Kasama hit the ground with a grunt, and Iruka held the fish arm man's in place, itching to twist it just a little bit more and break it. Iruka knew, however, if he tried that Kasama would be off the ground in a second and Iruka would be badly injured. Kasama was humoring him. Iruka stepped back and nearly fell over. He was covered in sweat and breathing hard. His muscles ached and burned, but he hadn't noticed before. He'd been so drawn into the sparring he hadn't thought about anything at all. Kasama stood up, and he was grinning madly. He had enjoyed the sparring match, even if he had been holding back. Iruka didn't know whether he was insulted or grateful. Iruka absently touched his forearm, which had a large lump on it from one of Kasama's more direct blows. Itachi was watching the two with half-lidded eyes, and he smiled slowly. I was beginning to wonder if I had imagined your competence when we were genin. Evidently I didn't. Iruka realized Kasama had looked to Itachi before agreeing to spar with him, and he felt rather small. He'd almost forgotten he was basically at the mercy of two S-class missing nin, which made Iruka sound like a dead man. Kasama leaned up against the tree Itachi was sitting by and looked down at Iruka. Where did a little minnow like yourself learn Kiriga Taijutsu? From an octopus and a starfish who came in on the ocean tide and lived in a riverbank, Iruka replied, feeling slightly crazy. He felt tired, yes, but he also felt dangerous. He felt like he had just jumped off the Hokage's monument and was still free falling. Octopus and starfish make dolphins. Itachi looked up from the scroll with a raised eyebrow. Tako and Haito Yumino, eh? Kasama looked thoughtful. Itachi looked back down at the scroll, evidently dismissing Kasama's wondering tone. Itachi's eyes stayed on the top of the scroll. Iruka tried to shake off the strange feelings that gripped him and squatted down by Itachi. So, do those make any sense to you? Iruka expected the Uchiha to ignore him, but Itachi looked up and nodded. Sealing and summoning jutsu are not my strongest point, but I see what they've done. The Yondaime seal isn't broken, but it's somewhere between cracked and suppressed. If we can find a way to suppress the Kyuubi enough, then Yondaime's seal should start working again and pull the Kyuubi back inside Naruto. The seal might never be as strong as it once was, but it will be working again. So, how do we suppress the Kyuubi enough for the seal to start working again, and how much does the Kyuubi need to be suppressed? Iruka pressed. Itachi gave a lazy shrug that was almost irritated. I don't know yet. As time goes on, the Kyuubi breaks out a little more, and there's no telling how much the Kyuubi needs to be suppressed for the seal to start working. The longer we take to find a solution, however, the harder it will be to get the Kyuubi back in the seal. Iruka sat down and pursed his lips. Could Naruto do it on his own, or will we need a jutsu to do it? If the boy could have done it on his own, we probably wouldn't be in this mess, Itachi put in. We'll need a jutsu, and a strong one at that. I don't suppose you just randomly happen to know any powerful sealing jutsu, do you? Iruka asked hopefully. Itachi gave him a look that said stop being stupid and went back to studying the scroll. Iruka sighed and began taking a mental inventory of his new bruises. The one of his forearm was already coloring, and promised to be pretty colors tomorrow, if one liked purple and blue. That's it. Kasama's bellow sent Iruka to his feet and into a defensive crouch. Itachi vanished completely. Kasama leapt to his feet and pointed at Iruka. Haitonami, daughter of one of the 7 swordsmen. She married a medic hunter nin named Yumino, killed an important political figure while she was 7 months pregnant, and both she and her husband got away from 3 squads of hunter shinobi sent after them. Your parents were Kiriga shinobi. Iruka stared at the pointing finger. Ah, they were. That's how you know Kiriga Taijutsu. Kasama looked up at the tree Itachi had been sitting next to and sent the branches an accusing glare. You never said you were on a genin team with an Yumino. I didn't know it mattered so much to you. The tree branches replied dryly. Mattered huh? Kasama shook his head. Haito Yumino only embodies the spirit of what all Kiriga shinobi strive to be. A man slighted her and she killed him while 7 months pregnant, wrote threats over the man's bedroom walls in his blood, and escaped all pursuit to disappear completely. She was ruthless, decisive, and let nothing stop her. Kasama took on a lecturing tone. Kasan would be pleased to know she's gotten so much fame back in Kiriga. I'm afraid being a fishmonger never really suited her, Iruka said with what might have been innocence. Kasama snorted as he heard the words fishmonger. I had no idea you had such vicious roots, Itachi observed as he dropped back onto the ground. Why did Sandaime place you in charge of children? Iruka flinched at the mention of the 3rd Hokage. It was better than mission desk duty all the time, and I like kids. Kasama made a disapproving noise and sat back down muttering something about wasting good shinobi. Itachi watched Iruka through half-lidded eyes, and Iruka felt like a goldfish being watched by a cat. A lot could happen in 2 days. Worlds and lives could be changed forever. Countries could fall and heroes could rise. 2 days could hold a lot of change, action, and potential. 2 days could also be extremely dull and inactive. Iruka had spent the past 2 days moving about the Kyuubi's forest to avoid the hesitant forays the ANBU made into it. Only the Kyuubi's presence kept the forest from being overrun with Konoha's finest killers. Kasama seemed disappointed, but Iruka was relieved. So far Iruka had managed to avoid killing any Konoha shinobi. At least he thought he had. Iruka wasn't sure he wanted to kill any Konoha shinobi, but if it came down to it he could, unless it was one of his students. Iruka couldn't even fight them, let alone kill one of them. The thought turned his stomach. "Oi, Oikawa-chan, green is not your color," Kasama said from the branch above Iruka. Iruka looked up at Kasama and nodded. He and Kasama had been sparring a lot over the past 2 days. Itachi just watched, and Kasama said something about digging out the Kirigakure shinobi in Iruka. Ever since learning his parents had been rather infamous Kirigakure shinobi, Kasama had taken a bizarre liking to Iruka. Iruka felt a little bit like a strange and exotic new pet, but he knew if he became a problem Kasama would dispose of him ruthlessly. Kasama was a true Kirigakure shinobi, just like Iruka's parents had been. Iruka's parents, despite having to hide from their home village in Konoha, had tried to make Iruka a true Kirigakure shinobi too. Iruka's formerly high-ranking shinobi mother had been refused a position as a Konoha shinobi, and had settled for teaching Iruka to be a Kirigakure shinobi. His mother's teachings had been at odds with the things Iruka later learned at Konoha's academy, but he solved the problem by compartmentalizing his different styles. His mother's teachings were for life or death situations, and his Konoha teachings were for everyday things. His father had also taught him, but those teachings had been different from his mother's. His father had taught him some basic medical jutsu, though Iruka could do nothing more complicated than stop bleeding. He was better at using the medical knowledge his father had given him to roughly tear people apart, but he hadn't done that in years. He wasn't allowed to use his Kiriga techniques in front of people anyway, but as he grew older he'd been used secretly to frame Kirigakure for assassinations and other things. Those missions were all off record, and technically hadn't even happened. Less than 10 people knew Iruka's parents had taught him to be a Kiriga shinobi, and most of those people were dead now. Iruka flinched away from the thoughts of how many people were dead, and crouched down on the tree branch. Death had become his enemy when he'd become a teacher. He taught his students to stay alive, keeping them away from death's greedy clutches. He'd been teaching them to use their opponents' deaths to keep their own deaths at bay. Kasama suddenly leapt off through the trees again, and Iruka scrambled to follow. He shook his brooding thoughts from his head and concentrated on keeping up with Kasama. After 9 days of running mostly on adrenaline and having his life in nearly constant danger, Iruka was starting to come down from the high those conditions had pushed him into. He felt sick for deserting Konoha, but he couldn't have done anything else. He could have gone back to Konoha and been locked up, but that wouldn't have helped Naruto. That was what this was all about. Iruka had done all this to help Naruto, and, if he thought about it long enough, it made sense. Iruka's loyalty had always been a little different than the average Konoha shinobi's. His loyalty was to the Hokage first, then his students, and after them came Konoha. Sandaime was dead, leaving Iruka's students as the ones he was most loyal to, and then Konoha had begun sending Iruka's students off without enough training and getting them killed. If Iruka applied a strange, twisted logic to the events, Konoha had first betrayed him and should have known better than to ask Iruka to choose between Konoha and one of his students. Kasama stopped, and Iruka dropped lightly onto the branches beside him. Itachi had left some time before down to sneak into Konoha and get food. The forest was mostly bare, and Itachi was, evidently, tired of just eating fish. Iruka had been wary about the Uchiha going back to Konoha so soon after they'd almost been caught, but he'd kept his mouth shut. Iruka was getting tired of getting "are you stupid" looks from his companions. It was now nearing dusk, and Itachi hadn't appeared. Kasama seemed unperturbed, and Iruka followed the fishman's example. Kasama knew what Itachi was capable of more than Iruka did. Iruka had only known the man as a genin, and now he was an S-class missing nin. Itachi suddenly appeared on the forest floor below them, and looked up before jumping neatly up the nearest tree to land on the branch by Kasama. He had a large pack slung over his shoulder, and looked pleased with himself. "Let's go," the Uchiha said before leaping off across the naked branches. Iruka leapt after him and, as always, Kasama brought up the rear. It still grated on Iruka's nerves to be reminded Itachi and Kasama thought of him as a liability, and that was truly what he was to them. Itachi finally dropped down onto the leaf-strewn floor, and Iruka and Kasama landed beside him in a small puff of leaves. Iruka grinned to himself. They all followed Itachi and moved together like a true shinobi team. But they were anything but a true team. They were a shaky alliance of traitors. Here, Itachi pulled a small bag from his back and threw it to Iruka. "Instant ramen, like you asked." Iruka had more accurately almost begged for it, but he had his reasons. Kasama gave Iruka a speculative look, but Iruka ignored it. Over the past 2 days, Iruka had come to a conclusion. The Kyuubi was following them. It wasn't around all the time, but Iruka knew at least once a day the Kyuubi crossed paths with them. Even if none of them saw the Kyuubi, Iruka knew the Kyuubi saw them. Iruka had taken Itachi's words about suppressing the Kyuubi to heart, and he'd thought long and hard about it. Naruto was slowly losing more and more control to the Kyuubi, and if Iruka couldn't suppress the Kyuubi, he could at least help Naruto keep what little control he had. Whenever the Kyuubi encountered something it was unfamiliar with, but Naruto knew Naruto seemed to gain more control. Iruka wasn't sure how well his plan would work, but he was going to try. Itachi had stopped them beside a small, shallow stream. The forest was riddled with tiny and larger streams, and it was easy to find water. Iruka dug one of the instant ramen bowls out of the bag, and knelt by the stream. He filled the bowl with water, making sure no fish swam into the bowl, and carefully folded his hands into signs. Cooling and heating water was an easy jutsu Iruka had learned when he was young. It was impractical for making ramen, really, but it was still easier than starting a fire. Iruka crouched over the ramen bowl and watched it steam. Iruka pulled a pair of cheap bamboo chopsticks out of the bag and placed them across the top of the ramen bowl. "What are you doing?" Kisama finally asked as Iruka stood and tied the ramen back shut. "Leaving out some ramen for Naruto," Iruka replied easily. "You're leaving out food for the Kyuubi." Kisama looked somewhere between horrified and amused. "Don't you know you're not supposed to leave food lying around when there's wild animals around, Oikawa-chan?" Iruka just smiled, and Itachi made a noise that might have been a laugh and gave Iruka a knowing look.
So I will continue the story in next part. Till then, we weeb offline.